I'm always a little surprised, bewildered, fascinated by how products get their names, especially when it comes to cameras, specifically, which is what I'll be talking about today. Lumix versus Panasonic, which I've talked at length about why the cameras are called Lumix versus being made by Panasonic and how you refer to them, or even other brands like Canon and its EOS or EOS or EOS, however you say it, Sony Alpha A7, blah, blah, blah. But isn't the A stand for Alpha? So why is it the Alpha A7, whatever, after the fact? It's so interesting to me how these things get named, how people talk about them, because even when I think of the Lumix cameras, no one ever said DMC GH5. It was just the Lumix or Panasonic GH5. It was never DMC, but when it's Canon, it's EOS or EOS, or however you say it, or Sony Alpha A7. It's just funny to me how these things get talked about and how things get named. We've also talked about this with Lumix and OpenGate, and what does that even mean? Or hybrid zoom. Some of these features get this terminology that you always wonder, is that really the best name for it? Real-time LUT? Is that what we should call it, or should we call it something else? But before we get started, like this video, hit the subscribe button, and consider joining the channel. Channel members get exclusive access to Filmmaker Alchemy, behind-the-scenes lessons and insights on the business of video production. Learn how to turn your content into gold. This has been on my mind recently because as a content creator, as someone who talks about these cameras, I do like to know about as many as possible, but it's equally challenging to know every make, every model, every SKU, Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3 from every single camera company. There's plenty of camera companies I don't pay enough attention to, probably Fuji, Olympus, I hardly ever mention just because they're not really on my radar and they have their whole other naming convention. Even Nikon, I don't talk about all that much. And even with Nikon, it's Nikon, Nikon, or if Nikkor, the Nikkor lenses, is that still a thing? I remember I used to have Nikon lenses, but you just had to know they were Nikkor or Nikkor, however you want to say it in your regional pronunciation. It's just so interesting to me that these names that seemingly have a rhyme or reason completely get abandoned. I think back to the days of the Canon EOS. How do you say it? I just always said the 5D Mark II, the 5D Mark III, never said EOS or EOS or EOS. It was nonsense. You don't need that. They're all EOS at this point in time. But we got the 5D Mark II, Mark III, and then we had things like the 7D. But then why was the 7D a crop sensor, or the 60D? Why was there the extra digit, the extra numeral in there? Shouldn't it have been the 70D? And in fact, I think there maybe even was a 70D at some point, or an 80D, I don't know. But then Nikon had it opposite, the D80, the D90. It was backwards from what Canon was doing. And then you've got Lumix. They had the G series, the G1, the G2, the G3, all the way up to the G9 Mark II, which is what we're on now. But then they added the GH series. So they had the GH1, GH2, GH3, all the way up to the GH5. And then instead of the GH6 coming out, they said, no, now we have a GH5 Mark II. And you're wondering, okay, is that what we're going to do? GH5 Mark II? Oh no, we do have a GH6 coming as well, and then GH7. So why did the GH5 get a Mark II? Assuming because it's popular. But there was also the GH5S as well, another special designation for speed or sensitivity, whatever the low light S stands for. You've got Sony and their naming convention, which is usually increments of, you have your A7, but then do they have like 70 or 700 or 6,000? I have a hard time keeping track of all of it. And then of course, Lumix took the GH naming or the G naming and completely switched it up for their S line. Now it's the S1 and the S5 and then the S5 Mark II. So presumably we'll get an S5 Mark III at some point. It won't be the S6, even though that would be copying what the G cameras did, where the numbers got higher as we advanced in years. And then I think of companies that like, who does it right? Who does it well? And I honestly don't really have an answer to that. Apple does a pretty good job, but even they, I think, kind of missed the mark a little bit with the Pro and the Pro Max and what number iPhone are we on now? Why don't we just, if they're coming out every year, why don't we just give it the name of the year it came out? iPhone 2025. No, it'll be the iPhone 17 or whatever crazy number they're on now. Even though I think the iPad is labeled differently, their MacBooks, their MacBook Pros are also labeled a little bit differently. So even if you're an informed creator trying to navigate this minefield of names, naming conventions, following what actually means what, let alone explaining that to, a regular person on the street just asking you, hey, what's a good camera to buy? Shoot, I couldn't even, speaking the language is hard enough already just because the models are so skewed. You would think something like an R7 or an R8 would be better than an R6 or an R5, but that's not true. If you're Canon, you want the lower numbers are actually the better numbers, but even that isn't necessarily true because maybe the R5 is better than the R3 or the R1, depending on who you're asking and what the purpose is. I get that at the end of the day, they're kind of just code names in a product guide, in a pamphlet, in a manual. Just here's the product designation so we can track it down. I was just at Home Depot and every, vacuum model has a different number, a little code name so you can look it up, the reference to the SKU in their book, right? But there's something, because these products get talked about as much as they do, you would think there'd be a better way to talk about them. I think of a company like Red and what they were doing with the Epic and the Scarlet and the Dragon, and you're thinking, okay, there's something to that, but even they lost their way a little bit with all the X and MX, and we've got VV Raptor XL. We've got all sorts of crazy naming that, again, is really hard to keep track of. I think there's a nice balance somewhere in between where we can have clear names that have some obvious significance of what it is, and then maybe a helpful designator if it is something that comes out each and every year, or just some rhyme or reason to the naming. It seems like even with Panasonic and those Lumix cameras, we have the S1 lineup, the S1H, the S1R, but then they did the S5 and the S5 Mark II, and then the S5 Mark II X, and then they have the S9. Even they seem to they sort of have a clear vision, but also not quite. They're just kind of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. Hey, the S5 II we think is popular. Let's make an X version. Well, why isn't there an S9X? Why isn't there an S1X? Is that just not a thing we do for those other SKUs and those other models? It never quite makes sense, and it's really hard to keep track of it all. I don't have a solution. I don't have an answer other than I wish there was a little bit more thought and intention brought to these things, because it just doesn't seem like anyone, they're like on a path, and I think they just feel stuck and they just keep going with what's working. And maybe that's the nature of it. At a giant corporation level, you just go with what's working, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it isn't always the clearest thing. I think of something like Sony and the A7S, and that was popular. So they made an A7S Mark II, and then that was popular. They made an A7S Mark III. Will they just keep making A7S Mark IV, Mark V, Mark VI, Mark VII forever? At a certain point, you'll probably want to make something else, like a rebrand, a relaunch, a refresh. Then what do you call it? They're already using A9, A1. I think those are out there. I don't think there's an A5. Maybe there's an A3. Again, it's hard to keep track of all of this. As someone, if you use the tools, if you use the devices, I think it's very easy to be comfortable and familiar with the names. I'm personally shooting on the Lumix S5 Mark II right now, and that's very easy, just rolls off my tongue because it's what I have in my case. It's what I'm using, the Lumix S9, very easy. But from a distance, from an outsider's perspective, if you don't shoot Nikon, if you're not really familiar with it, entering that territory, just trying to even understand, do I need a Z6? Do I need a Z7? I think there's a Z8 and a Z9, but then there's also a ZF. What's the difference? And then we've got Mark II and Mark III for some of them, but not for others. It's very hard to decipher, decode if you're not invested in it. And I think that's a disadvantage to all these companies who continue to name their products in this way. I think there's a much clearer, much easier way that would just need to be standardized by any company. Anyone could do it. They could just say, this is what we do, this is how we do it. Apple is probably the closest I can think of in terms of having some clarity to their naming convention, but even Apple misses the mark a little bit. If you're coming out, in a particular year, give it the year number. Maybe there's a hesitation of, we don't want to seem outdated, we don't want to seem old, we don't want to But the moment you start looking at these products and you're wondering which iPhone to get, and the iPhone 12, you're immediately looking like, what year did that come out? Oh, okay, that's a few years old. Now it immediately puts it into your brain. What time frame are we looking at? Well, it's 2025 now, so let's look for the newest model, whether it's 2024 or something coming out in 2025. What model is that going to be? Computers seem to do it a little bit better, but even, Apple has the MacBook, MacBook Pro, MacBook Air, which is the right one, which is the significant one. The Pro designation seems to be helpful in some regards, and I've seen other companies pick that up. DJI often has Pro versions of some of their products, and maybe that's something more for a company that's marketed primarily towards like regular consumers, lower budget, entry-level type stuff. Hey, here's a drone, but here's the Pro model. That's the better one. That's something I think more companies could use the Pro designation versus X or S or any other, arbitrary number or letter you want to throw at it. Just call it the whatever Pro if it is the upgraded one, the better one. But let's please avoid things like Pro Max, Pro Ultra, because at a certain point, they all just kind of lose their meaning if you're just throwing more adjectives at the problem to differentiate the better model from the slightly better model, from the best model. I find it really, it's not fun, maybe sarcastically fun to talk about this stuff and think about it and just kind of question, scratch your head and go, what are they thinking? What are they doing over there? Car manufacturers have a similar problem on their hands, although they do get the year right. It's very common for any car company to give you the year, make, model. Is that the order you would do it in? You know who's making it, and it has a name. It has something you can gravitate towards. It's the Mustang. It's the Camaro. It's the Grand Caravan. Give it a name. I want more companies to do that. Something that has a feel versus just an arbitrary set of letters and numbers that weren't used by the other company yet. Okay, well, we'll do GH over here, and we're going to go do A7s over here, and we're going to do Z whatever over here. Give it a name. Give it something cool. Give it a style, a vibe, even a look and a feel, I think could help differentiate these. Blackmagic Design is one of those companies, oddly enough, that makes things like the Ursa. And you go, okay, an Ursa, now I know what we're talking about, as opposed to the Pocket cinema camera. But even Blackmagic Design, they still get it wrong. There's plenty of cameras that have come from Blackmagic that I scratch my head and I go, how am I supposed to keep this straight? We've got the Ursa, and then we have the Ursa Mini. Okay, cool. But then the Ursa Mini is the only one that had any longevity. The Ursa is just done and dusted. We're done with the Ursa. The Ursa Mini sticks, and then we get the Ursa Mini 4.6K. Okay, cool. But then we get the Ursa Mini 4.6K G2, and you're wondering, well, if it's the G2, wasn't there a G1? Well, the G1, the 4.6K is the G1, but the regular Ursa Mini is the G0 then? But you didn't call it that. And then now we've got, is it the Ursa Mini LF? Do they even say Mini anymore? Or is it just Ursa Cinema Camera LF? What does LF even mean? Is that large format? It's not large format. Is that just what we're calling 35 millimeter full frame? Is it bigger than full frame? I don't know, because they're calling it large format now, because Ari is calling it LF, large format. How big is that? Is that actually large format? No, I don't think so. So what is it? We've got Fujifilm saying they make medium format cameras, and I don't think they're really, truly medium format. I think they're just bigger than full frame. But again, it's hard to know. It's hard to say from an outsider's perspective when you're just throwing buzzwords at your product saying, yes, this is good, it's better, this is the best, you want it, it's large LF, it's large format now. But is it large format? Because large format is like huge, and you're making digital sensors that big? Oh, no, you're not. You're just calling it large format because we're just making these things up now. I really, really wonder. Red, I guess, embraced the film terminology with VistaVision. Like, okay, but then you have to know what VistaVision is to even make sense of that. We have things like OpenGate, which used to be called anamorphic on the Lumix cameras because it was truly intended for anamorphic at first, but people stopped using it for anamorphic and they started using it for multi-aspect production. But instead of calling it multi-aspect or multi-format or full sensor, we're going to call it OpenGate, even though I don't think there's a film gate in a digital camera. I don't think that's a thing, but we're going to call it OpenGate. We're going to call it real-time LUT, even though everyone's scratching their head going, what is that? We're going to call it creative combined set, whatever that means. I made a whole video about the creative combined set, if I'm even getting that word right. It seems like there's a lot maybe lost in translation. I don't know what it comes down to, but there's a beauty to the way Apple names things sometimes, for as pretentious as it is. They come up with terminology that is, I don't know, it's so well, it just clicks, I guess, for customers, for consumers, where they go like, okay, yeah, I want the Apple, dynamic island or whatever, thing they come up with, even though it's nothing new. It's usually been on Android for years, and everyone will always say Apple's late to the game, but they come up with a clever name for it that gets you excited, gets you into it, and usually has some meaning that you can latch onto versus some of these other words that just get thrown out there as like, okay, yeah, sure, I guess that works, but is that the best? Can you trademark that? Can you stamp it? Can you make it your own? Like I said, I don't have a solution. I don't have an answer. It is certainly tricky and complicated at a corporate level when you are dealing with, millions and millions of products in inventory, and you've got tons and I don't even know how many thousands of SKUs are out there, all the different makes and models, stuff in progress, stuff that's old that's still being supported, stuff that's currently being promoted and marketed. It is challenging and it is complicated, but man, it sure is difficult to figure out. And maybe it's intentionally confusing. It's intentionally vague and mysterious to make customers, I don't know, does it encourage research? Do people just give up? Do they just buy whatever they find? Maybe that is the thing. Overwhelm people with too many options, too many choices, too many letters and numbers, and they'll just buy whatever you say is the newest thing. You push the new thing, and that's the one they'll buy. If it's Sony, is it the A7 IV? Well, isn't there an A7 R5? Isn't that like old now? Oh no, but the A7 V, that's the new one that everyone's looking forward to. Well, how about the A7S? That's only on the Mark III, so then that would be the Mark IV, but 4 is lower than 5. So which one do you want me to buy? These are the types of questions I have and the level of confusion that's presented just because these things are named so poorly, I think. I'd prefer a better naming convention, naming style. Like I said, car models are nice. They give it a feel. When you have a name to latch onto, whether it's, I don't care. You're always going to have a feeling about a word more than a set of numbers or letters. I think I used to like growing up as a kid, I liked the Nissan, is it the 350Z? I thought was a cool car. But 350Z, like that's meaningless compared to something like the Mustang or the Camaro or the Corvette. I think that's really smart, actually, giving it a good name that, I don't know, you latch onto. It feels like something. And then, yeah, throw the year that it came out on there and then add Pro at the end if you need to, if it's the better one, if you need 2 models. But I think you'll leave it at that. It doesn't need to be more complicated. Just give it a good name. Tell me the year it came out. Is it Pro or is it regular? And I said I didn't have a solution. I didn't have an answer, but I think that's, for me, that would be the answer. I just came up with it, talking through it in real time. Because I think that's all I would like, just to know. Okay, what are we getting? The Ursa Mini? Okay, that's what it is. Okay, call it the Ursa Mini. Give it the year that it came out. Pro or non-pro. That's all I need. And you can come up with other names. The Venus, call it the, I don't know, like the Mars, that's the Hollyland, the Mars system, and the Pyro system. I can actually recall those pretty easily because they have a good name. Atomos does that with the Shinobi, the Shogun, the Ninja. That's kind of a fun, the Sumo, kind of fun naming convention that you can get to. And then, yeah, just the year it came out and pro or non-pro. That's all I need. Simple. You can have a product number, letters and numbers behind the scenes, kind of behind that, the forefront of your marketing. But I think I just want more, I don't know, not dragon. Red took that one. Unicorn. No one's made the unicorn. No one's made the Holy Grail. For as much as YouTubers talk about unicorns and Holy Grails, no one's made a camera called the unicorn or called the lens called the Holy Grail. Lenses are a different story because they give you the specs of the lens. So I'm not even talking about those, which is actually kind of helpful. Just give me the focal range, aperture, and that's probably, yeah. And if I know the mount that it comes in, that's kind of all I need to know. They do the Mark 1, Mark II, Mark III thing for lenses, but I think that's sufficient. That's fine. It's the cameras that have such a problem because they never define in the name what the camera can actually do. It's just, again, like I said, letters and numbers that you kind of have to speak the language to know what it even does or how it works. Let me know what you think. I would be curious. Do you have a better solution than the one I came up with? Am I complaining about nothing? Yeah, probably. But these are the things I think about. These are the conversations I like to have. If you hate it, I'm sorry you made it this far. But if you have a good idea, let me know. What's the better way to go about this? Because I think these companies need a little guidance. They need our help. They need some recommendations. We just keep feeding back A7S, R5 Mark II, S5 Mark II. Like, we just feed back what they give us. But I don't think anyone's really saying, hey, pause the brakes here a little bit. Let's slow down. Let's figure out a better naming for all of this because it's quite confusing. Canon, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, they're all guilty. They all have terrible names from my perspective. And not that they need to change it drastically, but how am I supposed to, you got the R5, the R6, the R7, the R8. Is there an R9? I don't think so. Why isn't there an R9? Is there an R50? I think there actually is. There might be. Maybe there's not. Is there an R60? I don't know. Nikon, you've got Z every number, practically. You got ZF. What does that mean? What's the right solution to this problem? Is there one? Probably not. But I would love to hear your thoughts.